Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Taking Care of Business. The man who rules the world breaks in a brand new partner to help him take care of business in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Taking Care of Business at paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Comic book YouTubers have been extremely dishonest with their audience. Now, if you listen to many of these comic book YouTube channels, they will have you believing that the comic book industry is filled with social justice warriors who are practically destroying the comic book medium. And as these comic book YouTubers sit here and talk about comics, they usually talk about these social justice warriors who are on Twitter, and they also talk about these revelations that are presented in the pages of Marvel and DC Comics. Now, these comic book YouTubers, they present an extremely negative picture, and they present that for a series of extremely dishonest reasons. Now, your comic book YouTubers make these statements about these social justice warriors on Twitter, and they also talk about these revelations. And the main reason why they go out here and present these types of topics is because these kinds of topics get them lots of views. Now, your comic book YouTubers are no different than your comic websites like your Comic Book Resources or your comicbook.com in trying to go out here and create clickbait content in an effort to get views for their content creators. And negative content gets you a lot more views than positive content. So a lot of the comic book YouTubers, they will sit there and talk about these social justice warriors on Twitter and what they said, and they'll sit there and talk about these shock revelations, all because it generates lots of views for their channel. And because these channels are monetized, these YouTubers can go out here and make lots of money at the expense of the comic fans who get caught up in the controversy. Unfortunately, a lot of that controversy that these comic book YouTubers create only profits the comic book YouTubers, and it does not help the medium of comics overall. Now, many of these comic book YouTubers, they are being dishonest when they sit there and complain about Marvel and DC Comics, which seem to be the only two companies that many of the comic book YouTubers love to complain about. They only focus on the medium of superhero comics produced at Marvel and DC, and they don't really even talk about any of the good books that are currently being produced at Marvel and DC right now. And I've seen several good books at Marvel, like the recent run of Daredevil, which has been absolutely fantastic, the new Moon Knight series, which has been absolutely great, or the Black Panther series that just came out in 2021 and seems to be rock solid. No, when your comic book YouTubers sit here and talk, they will sit here and talk about all of the bad books at Marvel and DC, but they won't talk about any of the good books that are currently being produced. And these guys will sit here and talk about how bad the industry is, but they won't sit here and talk about ways to improve the industry or try to generate sales on the books that are actually good. Now, if you care about comics like I do, and I've been a comic fan ever since I was about 4 years old, you want to see good books get into the hands of readers. You want to see these books that really are great get into the hands of readers so that these books can be able to remain on the catalog and continue to get a following. Because again, books like your Daredevil, your Moon Knight, your Black Panther, absolutely good books over at Marvel, these are books that are getting ignored because everybody wants to talk about the woke books at Marvel. And then there are other books like Blue and Gold, which is a Nightwing, which don't get talked about over at DC on these channels, but they'll sit there and talk about, oh, the latest Captain Marvel. They'll talk about the Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, or any of the other social justice characters. And talking about these bad characters at these bad books does not really help generate sales or get new readers into books. And that if these guys again are serious about helping the comic book industry be able to get to a competitive place, you would think they would sit here and talk about those books that are really good. And I find it interesting that your comic book YouTubers, again, while they're complaining about the social justice warriors destroying the industry, they practically ignore all of the great independent books currently being produced right now. Now, last week, Todd McFarlane recently launched a new Spawn team book called The Scorched, which is absolutely fantastic. And this book has sold over 300,000 copies, but many of the comic YouTube channels are so busy complaining about social justice warriors that they've practically forgotten about Todd's great success with The Scorched, and they don't even talk about many of the great independent books that are currently on the market, like the current AWA series Chariot that came out last year, a fantastic reinterpretation of the whole Knight Rider concept. That book came and went, and nobody talked about it except for my channel after one of my Facebook friends showed me the book and I saw how great it was. You didn't hear any of the comic YouTubers saying, hey, go pick up this Chariot book from AWA and help that book generate some sales, because these guys, again, have 70, 80, sometimes 100,000 subscribers, and if 10,000 of their subscribers picked up a book like Chariot, that could have put that book over and got it higher up on the Comic-Con sales and practically made that book into one that a comic shop would go out here and order on the regular. I mean, these comic book YouTubers, again, have so much influence on their audience. They don't use it to go out here and try to generate sales for all of these absolutely great books that I'm seeing on the indies that are currently in comic shops, or many of the indie books that I have picked up on platforms like Indiegogo and Kickstarter and shared with my viewers on my channel. And I've even had companies like Concrete Comics send me titles, and I've even bought Concrete Comics, which is another great small indie company that has been producing some absolutely fantastic comics, like the upcoming Tenoch God of Fire, which is currently on Kickstarter right now, the previous book, Your Odina, and Acolyte, which is absolutely, at the third issue, was the best comic as I see it of 2021, and I'm looking forward to the next Absolver and the next Odina. Concrete has been producing some just absolutely fantastic books, but you won't hear about any of those books from your comic YouTubers, because all many of them are doing is sitting here complaining about these social justice warriors at Marvel and DC Comics, and they have the notion that superhero comics are the only thing going on as related to comics. No, superhero comics are what Marvel and DC are best known for, but superhero comics are not the comic book medium, and superhero comics are not the comic book industry, and Marvel and DC Comics are not the comic book industry anymore. They are two of the bigger competitors in the comic book industry, and they have a large catalog of characters we have all grown up with, from your baby boomers to Generation X, but many of our kids, they're not going to grow up with those characters, and you can't explain that to the comic book YouTubers who are stuck in the past. But many of the comic book YouTubers are stuck in the past because they just want to be able to have they want the comic book world to go back to the way it was, but it's not going back to the way it was because we're in a completely different century. Now, I also believe that some of these comic YouTubers, they believe that they can go out here and make these videos complaining about the industry, that they will go out here and get noticed by these comic book companies. And this is a covert contract that some of these comic YouTubers have, that if they sit here and complain about Marvel and DC long enough, what will happen is that the editors at Marvel and DC will see them complaining, and eventually somebody will offer them some sort of employment. That's a covert contract that I believe that's motivating some comic YouTubers to complain about the two companies above all the other comic book companies out here. And they think that if they sit here and complain and talk about how bad these so-called SJW books are, eventually one of these editors at the top will eventually see how passionate they are and want to hire them. But that covert contract is one that will never be fulfilled, because when you go out here and you're complaining about a product, this is just not a way to get attention. Now, your Gail Simone, many years ago, she pulled this hustle back in the 90s talking about women in refrigerators, and I'm guessing that's the thing that has many of the comic book YouTubers motivated to keep making these videos, talking about how bad the industry is and how bad these SJWs are destroying your Marvel comics and your DC comics. So that's what the reason that motivates them is they saw Gail Simone get in the door that way, and they're believing they themselves can get in the door that way. Now, another covert contract that some of these comic YouTubers have is they are using the complaints about the Marvel and DC comics and the SJWs to sell their own Kickstarters and their own Indiegogos. And many of these comic YouTubers believe that they are going to be the saviors of the comic book industry by creating what they believe to be superior products. So they've created a covert contract where they'll complain about the bad comics over at Marvel and DC, and then promote themselves as saviors with their so-called far superior products, and wishing and praying again as they're creating their far superior products that they will go out here and eventually be noticed by the big two, and eventually they will get hired at Marvel and DC Comics. Again, more covert contracts as related to the complaining, but the solution that they're having is they want to go out here and actually be working at Marvel and DC, and that's why they keep complaining about the so-called woke comics at Marvel and DC Comics. So these approaches that some of these what they call comic YouTubers use, they are all about disingenuousness and dishonesty. And again, it's not about generating sales of good books and getting good books in the hands of readers. Because if you truly care about the comic medium, you will want to see really good books by other creators get out here in the hands of readers. Like recently, Kevin Grievu gave me a copy of his Rise of the Djinn comic, which was great. And he gave me a copy of one of the books that I have just loved and I really enjoyed, the Bass Reeves miniseries. And once I got those comics, I shared them with my viewers. And after I shared them with viewers, I put up a link to where you could get both of those books. And people are picking up those books and seeing how great they are. And it's generating sales of those books. And I've also done that for many concrete comics, like the Kickstarter that's going on right now for Tenoch, God of Fire, and books like the Acolyte #3 and Odina #3. And I want to see these companies that are producing great comics go out here and get the sales that will allow them to continue expanding their catalog. And I want to see great comics get in the hands of readers. That's what means a lot to me. I mean, yes, I have my own products that are coming up, like the upcoming John Haynes at Death's Door comic, but I also want to see a healthy overall comic book industry, and you can't get to healthy continuing to complain about whatever shock revelation or whatever some SJW is saying on Twitter, because while that generates lots of clicks and views for these websites, it does not put money in the hands of creators that allows them to build their audience or allows the business of a comic publisher to expand. Because it really saddens me when I see a great book like the Yara Flora Wonder Woman wind up getting canceled due to poor sales, even though there were issues with the concept. But it just saddens me that this book does not really get the sales because people either ignore it or pay it no attention. And again, Comic YouTube could easily help these books by talking about these books that are out here languishing on store shelves. Great books that deserve an audience, but instead of talking about the good books that are out here, they sit there gossiping about what SJWA said on Twitter. And Twitter is not a place where you can really sell comics. No, Twitter is a site where a lot of these comic guys go to complain about the business, but they don't really focus on the solutions, and it's fostering what I see to be a codependent relationship. Now, the comic YouTubers, they originally came looking for a solution, but they are becoming part of the problem, because every video you make complaining about comics at Marvel and DC shows that it's all about just Marvel and DC to you, and you believe that Marvel and DC are comic books, but superhero comics are not just the business. There are so many different great comics out here and so many great stories, but nobody sits there and talks about them because it doesn't get the views. And sadly, I've seen that myself, because when I go out here and I do a review video talking about how great a comic is, I don't really see the numbers for those videos. But if I go out here and I do a roast video, it'll get all the clicks and views in some cases. But the videos that I do that are positive, one of the things that I see that comes out of them is that it generates sales for those comics. But your comic YouTube, again, they are not about a solution, because solutions don't profit them. They want to continue to complain about the so-called SJWs, because the codependent relationship they are having with the SJWs on social media profits them, and they continue going back and forth with the SJWs on social media because they can go out here and build an audience of 60, 70, 80,000, and even 100,000 subscribers, and they can then use that to sell their savior products on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. And they do this, and again, it doesn't help the medium of comics, and it doesn't help get good comics in the hands of readers. All it does is it fosters a very dysfunctional environment, and a very dishonest one, because this is not about, it's not looking like you're trying to improve the comic book industry like you say, or facilitate any change. And all it is about you making change for yourself in your pocket, and then continuing to promote the same dysfunction to comic book readers, that there's all of these problems going on, but the problems don't ever change because you don't have an economic incentive to make the changes, because you're making so much money from the YouTube ad clicks, and you're also making money from the Indiegogos and the Kickstarters you launch. So many of these guys, they make a lot of money complaining about a Tom King and his bad Batman run, or whatever SJW comic is being produced, or whatever shock revelation, but they don't want to go out here and talk about a great book like the recent books that I've talked about previously. And I don't want to talk about those books because that's not going to make them any money. But that doesn't help the medium of comics, because if you really love comics, you want to see great comics get into people's hands, and you want to see readers picking up comics like I do. And that's why I talk more about the good comics these days, because we are living in an age where there are some absolutely great comics, absolutely fun comics, and that life is too short to spend it complaining about the bad in the industry when there's so much good going on and so many fun and great comics on platforms like Indiegogo, Kickstarter, and even at Marvel and DC Comics. There's so much great material out there, but you just have to go out here and change your perspective on comics if you hope to discover your next great fun series. Now, I hope to have my upcoming comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, available soon. And I've just talked to the artist, Antonio Balderi, and we are on the third act, is practically complete on John Haynes at Death's Door. So all that's left to do is the next 5 pages of the conclusion, and the cover and the book will be on its way to having the art complete. And once the art is complete, I'm going to send it to the letterer. And as the letterer is working on the book, I'm going to launch the Kickstarter. So I'm hoping to have John Haynes at Death's Door available soon. But until then, you can pick up a copy of Esteem, No Good Deed on Kindle for 99 cents and check out my first comic on Amazon.com for just 99 cents. And if you want to pick up some of my action-packed African-American fantasy fiction, like the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Esteem Counsel Vacation. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a social justice, social media mob looking to counsel her in this all-new Esteem